Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to talk in our series on Indian philosophy. This is the first lecture on Nyaya Philosophy which we are taking and would be talking more in our forthcoming session. Dear friends, under this series that is Indian philosophy, we have covered numerous sessions and we believe that through this session also, which is on Nyaya Philosophy, as I already told you, this is the first session. Here we are going to give you the introduction to Nyaya Philosophy, and for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Dr. Ajay Verma. Dr. Ajay Verma is Associate Professor in Center for Philosophy, School of Social Sciences, JNU. Dr. Ajay Verma is a prolific professor who believes in giving his best to the students. So let's welcome our guest Dr. Ajay Verma and let's try to grab maximum knowledge through him, and let's try to understand what Nyaya Philosophy is. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Geetika. Hello viewers. So as you have already been apprised of, today we'll be discussing yet another school of Indian philosophy, namely Nyaya. And the method that we would be following is that we would like to read from some of the slides which have been taken from some important sources and introductory sources to Indian philosophy, including Janardhan Ganeri's Philosophy in Classical India and Veena Gupta's Introduction to Indian Philosophy. And we'll try to understand the overall idea that is purported in Nyaya school of thought. So, first of all, let's try and understand very broadly what Nyaya philosophy is about. What is their what are the broad contours of their philosophical framework? So, in order to understand that, first of all, if we just look at the term Nyaya, which basically, if you look at it from the point of view of a Sanskrit meaning, it means logic, reasoning, and so on. So basically, the focus is on logic and reasoning, and through that, gradually bringing clarity to our judgments, to our thought, which helps us determining and the true nature of objects and discerning our judgments. Even if we actually, as a matter of fact, we can try and understand it even better if we look at, if we divert our attention from the ancient use of the term Nyaya and instead look at its current use, which is, in sort of current Hindi, we use the term Nyaya to signify justice. But if we can understand what broadly the Nyayiks, which is the term which refers to those philosophers, ancient philosophers who sort of agreed to the basic tenets of the system. So even if we look at the current usage of the term, which through Nyaya, by Nyaya we generally mean justice. So even in the pursuit of justice, what we are aiming at is the actual state of affairs. What we are aiming at is the truth of the matter, the things as they actually occurred, the events as they actually occurred at a particular point of time. So even when we use the term Nyaya in its current usage, which means justice, we are actually not very far away from the actual pursuit that this school of thought follows. So broadly speaking, here the idea is what the Nyayiks are trying to do is that. When we open our senses to the world, we find a whole range of things that that are there presented before us, and we form their cognitions. And cognition, is in a certain way initially immune to assert so it's whether it's true or false. it's immune initially, as pure science data. It is immune to such kind of ascertainments. But gradually the idea is that if we don't cognize our world, if we don't know our world in the way it actually is, then we don't really know how to act towards it. So basically the idea here is, if we don't have the correct description of the world before us, then also it has a bearing upon our actions, which would mean that if we don't know what a thing is, we also don't know what to do with that thing. And if we don't know what to do with that thing, then it's this more or less it's tantamount to a kind of a state of bondage. So knowing things in their true nature, which basically also means knowing the things as what they are, and also concomitantly knowing the differentia, in the sense also knowing what they are not. Both these things, sort of are as would stand to reasoning, are concomitant. When we know what a thing is, we also, in the same act of knowing, know what it is not. So when we have such clarity of judgment, when we know what is, how a thing is generically defined, and also what, how it should be correctly categorized, and also when we understand its differentia, from other things, also when we know how a particular thing is different from other things, such knowledge is conducive to liberation. And ultimately, liberation is viewed, about which we'll be talking in more detail later. So, just to make clear, since all the schools of Indian philosophy, excepting probably Charvakas, have a very clear conception of what they mean by liberation, and most the schools of Indian philosophy are geared towards some soteriological idea. So therefore, this idea in Nyaya philosophy is that if we know the world correctly in its generic terms, also in terms of differentia, internal sort of differentia that things have, which makes one thing different from the other, if we know the world with in terms of its similarities and differentia, then we know how to act towards the world. Then also we know the true nature of the self, how sort of self is different from other things, also how self sort of the qualities that are associated with the self are only accidental to it, are only adventitious quality, and when we know the self along with its differentia from its other qualitative states, from manas, from other kind of sort of qualities that are associated with it, that is tantamount to the state of liberation. Now, having stated that, let's begin. Let's also try and take a very brief historical account of this school of thought. As a matter of fact, Nyaya school started earlier. There were these philosophers who were known as Tarkikas, whose pursuit was basically to formulate the right, correct rules of argumentation and debate. So their sole purpose was to train people in the art of debating and argumentation, irrespective of what the other person has come to them for training, whatever belief system, whatever sort of set of ideas that person may have, their overall effort was to ascertain the rules of judgment, the rules regarding debating, argumentation, different kinds of debates. What counts as a good debate, what counts as good reasoning, what counts as good proof. These were some of the basic aims that they were targeting. But eventually, later on, after the founder of the school, Gautama, writes, the foundational text of the school, namely Nyaya Sutra, and around which is dated around 250 Christian era. After this, there's a certain metaphysics that comes to be associated with this school. This school comes to have another name, namely Nyaya. And they borrow most of their metaphysics from another school, namely Vaisheshikas, about whom we would talk in some later lectures. So later on, after Nyaya Sutras are written, this comes to be to assume a status of a full-fledged philosophical school, and becomes a part of Shaddarshanas, the 6 orthodox schools of philosophy. So now let me read from some of the important texts, secondary texts of introductory texts of Indian philosophy, and then we'll move from there. So, as a part of the introduction, we must remember that the Nyaya school most likely had its origin in this attempt to formulate canons of argument for use in debates, which pervaded the Indian philosophical scene for a long time. The term Nyaya, meaning the rules of logical thinking and the means of determining the right thing, gives us a clue to overall program of this thought system. Thus originally indicated as a system of logic, laying down the rules of logical argument, Nyaya, also known as Anvikshiki, blossomed into a systematic school and found its legitimate place among the 6 Vedic systems of philosophy, also known as Shaddarshanas. The Nyaya was first systematized by Gautama in the Nyaya Sutras, which are dated between 250 to 450 CE, which belongs to the post-Buddhistic period, and it is important to point out that the Nyaya Sutras were written post-Buddhistic period, because in most of the Nyaya texts we find that they engage in a lot of debate with different schools of Buddhism. And the result was that as a consequence, as a result of this debate, constant debate between Nyaya and Buddhism, both the schools evolved. So we have and as a result, responding to their Nyaya counterpart, a whole school of logic emerged from within Buddhism, and one of the most celebrated names amongst Buddhist logicians is Dignag, and and some of these logicians were constantly in engagement. They were engaging in debate with Nayayika. Say, for example, Dignaga, he was debating in most of the texts that he's writing. He's debating with different Nayayikas on different issues, which includes perception, nature of Pramanas, the nature of knowledge, and so on and so forth. So, further than that, this system, which is Nyaya system, starts with the postulate that all knowledge by its very nature points to an object beyond it and independent of it. These objects, it is added, are independent not only of knowledge but also of one another. Whence the doctrine may be described as pluralistic realism. But by this description, we should not assume that the data of knowledge are all disconnected. So basically, here we must sort of try and understand that as far as Nyaya system is concerned, they believe that objects of knowledge exist independently of that of their knowledge, which basically means that they believe in realism. So the idea in realism is that, as opposed to idealism, of course, because the main thesis in idealism is that things are nothing but ideas. So anything, any object of knowledge could be ultimately reduced to a set of ideas. and we have no way of bridging the gap between what we consider to be reality out there and the source of its knowledge, which is within us in terms of ideas. As opposed to that, Nyaya, being a realist school, believes that objects have an independent existence apart from the knowledge of them. And apart from that, another belief that they hold on to is that these objects of knowledge are various. They vary from each other. So there is an amount of differentia that exists between them. And as a matter of fact, they postulate, they think of an entirely different kind of negation, which is called sansarga bhav, which basically is assumed to account for the differentia between any two objects. So, this sansarga bhava is a kind of negation which accounts for differentia between two things. And, it's of the form, chairs are not tables, tables are not books, books are not tables, and so on and so forth. So, which basically means that things are not only independent of the knowledge of them that we have, but also things are independent of each other as well, and things differ from each other. So there is some kind of an aspect of generality to them, and there is also an aspect of differentia to them. So which makes this school, a school of which makes it a school which ascribes to realism and pluralism alike at the same time. So, and also another thing that we should remember is that they also don't think of things of knowledge as of things as disconnected. So they also think of sort of that things have an internal structure to them. They are they exist as a whole, as a systematic whole. Also, they have some real parts. And there is a particular scheme, around which the parts are arranged and make up a whole. And apart from this internal schematic unity, things also bear particular kind of relations with each other externally as well, like sanyog, which could be a chance happening, and so on. And yet another postulate that they hold is that things have a particular structure, a kind of a schematic unity, which is also reflected in our knowledge of it. So the kind of structure, the kind of schematic unity that an object has, the same structure is followed in our knowledge of it. So the same structure is also not only followed when we know the object, but also is reflected in our knowledge of it. So, according to Nyaics, the structure of the object and its knowledge and the language in which we express this knowledge, all these three, namely abhideyatva, geyatva, and the existence, the astitva of things, all these three are interrelated and bear some kind of congruence with each other. Their structure is congruent. The structure that an object has is reflected as it actually is in our knowledge, and it is reflected also in the structure of our language. So these are some of the important tenets of this system. Now, all these presuppositions actually are very precisely and very nicely summed up in the very first sutra of Nyaya Sutra, and it will be relevant for us to read out from Vatsyayan's commentary on Nyaya Sutras. is this commentary on the very first sutra of Nyaya Sutra, where he says, and I quote, "When the object is known by the Pramana, one's practical response becomes successful and the Pramana becomes objectively valid. In the absence of Pramana, there is no knowledge of the object. Without knowledge of the object, there is no ability of activity to be successful. This knower, by experiencing the object by Pramana, wants either to acquire the object or shun it. His practical effort, as qualified by his desire to acquire or shun the object, is called pravritti. The intended object or artha is either pleasure or the cause of pleasure, pain or the cause of pain. The practical purpose of this pramana, the goal which the pramana has to reach, is innumerable, because the differences among living beings are innumerable." So here, as stated earlier, basically, the idea is that all of us form particular judgments about the world. It's almost inevitable when we lend our senses open to the world. Then we can't help it, but we would form judgments about the world, and those judgments have to be true if our efforts based on those judgments have to be successful. And if our efforts towards the world are unsuccessful, then it results in frustration, and frustration is not a state of existence that would appeal to us. So we would rather imagine a state of existence where we formulate judgments which are truly reflective of the actual nature of the object, and on the basis of which, when we act, we are likely to succeed in our efforts towards that object. So the idea here is that generally, whenever we talk about action, and living is basically nothing but a series of actions, thinking and action, and all actions precede thinking, and most of the thinking is followed by action, is followed by living according to what you are thinking. So, accordingly, what happens is that we form judgments, which produces a certain kind of pravritti, dispositions in us. So, when we know as an object as such and such, we respond actively to it by either shunning that object of knowledge, either sort of liking it, disliking it, wanting to possess it, or not wanting to possess it, or being simply indifferent to it. So according to Nyaya philosophy, these could be three responses that we may have based on our judgment of things. We may like to act towards the judgment, and we may make an effort to possess it. We may dislike it, or we may be simply indifferent to it. So in since we want our activities to be successful, there we also want our judgments to be true, because only true judgments would lead to successful activity. And to form true judgment requires a rational activity, whereby the cognition that we may have, different kind of sort of cognitions and different kind of confusion regarding that cognition we may have, are removed, and thereby we achieve a state of certainty, and that state of certainty about the nature of a thing is reached in forming a well-ascertained judgment about a particular object in question. So that's so the overall overall program of Nyaya philosophy is very well articulated in this in this comment by Vatsyayana on the first of the Nyaya Sutras. So also apart from this, Vatsyayana, who's one of the most important commentators on Nyaya Sutra, also stresses that in virtue of the connection that exists between knowledge of the object and the success or failure in one's goal concerning it, one should employ some suitable method of knowing if one wants to succeed. The theory of rationality in this way depends on a theory of the proper means of acquiring true beliefs. So, basically what we want to point out from this passage is that knowledge is invariably connected, with action and action with knowledge. So, there is this very clear kind of a link between between our actions and our judgments. So, when we want to be sure about judgments, because we want our activities to result in success, therefore we have to be sure about our means of knowledge, the means through which we acquire our knowledge. So that leads us to an inquiry about the nature of knowledge and the sources of that knowledge. So, here the point to understand is a very clear link that is established between our successful activity and the epistemological aspect of it, in the sense that if we have right knowledge, that would result in successful activity, and right knowledge requires a proper examination of the source of that knowledge, and therefore we need to sort of have a proper theory of knowledge, which looks part of which part of that inquiry would be the nature of sources of knowledge. So nature of sources of different nature, an inquiry of the nature of different sources of knowledge. And source of knowledge, source of valid cognition, is termed as Pramana in most of the schools of classical Indian philosophy. So now this leads us into how Nyayics believe, how Nyayics theorize about the nature of knowledge and the nature of means of knowledge, namely Pramana. So Pramana is an unerring concomitant of an object. As a Pramana articulates its object, so is the object in itself. By the success of a practical response is meant the response which leads to success. But a Pramana does not directly lead to successful practice. It leads to success via the true cognition of the object. After the practice is successful, the fact the Pramana has truly grasped the object is ascertained by inference. The point here is that no cognition, without being true, can generate response which reaches the object. So the point here is that Pramana reveals its object in its true nature. So Pramana leads to a judgment of an object which reflects its object as in its true nature, and that ultimately results in a successful activity. And the truth of the knowledge, truth of our cognition, is also in that sense indirectly ascertained through inference, because if our judgment leads to successful activity, that means that is also viewed as a sign, as veracity, as a sign of veracity of our cognition in the first place. So this is how these are some of the very broad basic presumptions that Nyayics make when they try to come up with their own well articulated theory of knowledge. So we'll talk further about Nyaya epistemology when we return after a short break. Thank you.
Listener, thank you so very much for giving us this productive session on Nyaya Philosophy. Friends, there is a lot more for you. You're requested to be with us as we are back after a short break. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to the session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on Indian philosophy, and in Indian philosophy we are trying to understand what Nyaya philosophy is. This is the first lecture in the series, I would say. In the Nyaya philosophy, I would say this is the first lecture of Nyaya philosophy. In our previous session we discussed a lot, and as we promised, here we are again to discuss more on Nyaya philosophy. Friends, for the discussion of the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Ajay Barma. Dr. Ajay Barma is an associate professor in JNU. So let's welcome our guest Dr. Barma and let's try to understand more about Nyaya philosophy. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thanks, Geetika. Friends, as you would remember, we were discussing the idea of Pramana as discussed by different Nyayic philosophers, and there we try to see why Pramana is such an important issue for Nyaya philosophy, and what kind of sort of assumptions they have about Pramana, and so on. Now, subsequent to that, we also must remember that since the Pramana correctly apprehends its object, by definition, Pramana is the source of valid cognition, source of valid knowledge. Since the Pramana correctly apprehends its object, the knower, the object of knowledge, the knowledge itself, all three become invariable accompaniments of the object. Because without a Pramana, there is no determination of the object. The knower is the one who has the practical response arising out of desire to possess the object or the hatred to shun it. Pramana is that by which he knows the object. The object that is known is Prameya. The knowledge of the object is Pramiti. Since all these four, meaning the knower, which is Pramatra, Pramana, the means of knowledge, Prameya, the object of knowledge, and Pramiti, the knowledge itself, also known as Prama. But Pramiti refers to Prama as a resultant of this activity. So as whenever we talk about something as a resultant of a Pramana, then we add the word iti to it, like anumati, upamiti. So knowledge. So all these four, Pramatra, Pramana, Prameya, and Pramiti, invariably accompany the object. And with these four, the nature of the truth, that is tattva, is exhausted. So basically, here the idea is that another peculiarity that Nyaya philosophy shares is that according to them, an object presents itself as it actually is. So it lends itself to a knowledge situation in its fullness, along with its totality, along with its completeness. And when we know it as, we know it along with its fullness. So when we know an object, say for example table, then we know everything about that table. It's not that a certain part of this table would stay hidden from us. So which is like say for example the Kantian idea, the bifurcation, the division that he makes between the knowable part of an object and the object and that part of the object which doesn't lend itself to the categories of thought that characterizes the knower. So, according to Nyaya philosophers, the knowing conditions, the knowing situation, which comprises of the knower, the means of knowledge, the object of knowledge, and the knowledge itself, it is exhaustive of anything that is there in the world, that is anything that is that is to be known. It exhausts the nature of truth altogether. So, therefore, the Naiyics don't leave any scope for what you could call mysticism. There is no scope for, say for example, there could be certain philosophies like Shunyavad philosophy, like Anirvachniyata, that is used a lot in Advait school, of Shankara. So, any thoughts about inadequacy of language, any thought about our sort of human knowledge being incomplete, or the presentation of the object being incomplete, any such thoughts are not entertained in Nyaya philosophy. So, now apart from that, we must also try and understand what is the nature of knowledge or prama on a Nyaya account. So, according to Nyaya philosophy, the generic nature of knowledge, this is what we want to know. That knowledge is called anubhuti or jnana. According to the Nyaya, consciousness and knowledge are synonyms. Not so, however, in other Indian systems of thought. So, for example, knowledge is of the nature of anubhuti, meaning there is a subjective aspect to it. There is a kind of cognitive episode that it begins with, a cognitive episode that that happens, so to speak, to the knowing subject. Which is presentative in character, in the sense that that knowing episode belongs to an object in question, that an object that is presented to us. So anubhuti also means that that our knowledge has this character of being presentative, of not being representative, which also helps Naiyics to differentiate between knowledge which begins with a cognitive episode, and smriti, which is another variety of cognitive episode, but is not counted as prama, since it lacks a presentative character, because its object lies not before us. It is representative in character because its object lies somewhere in the past, and since it doesn't have that presentative character, therefore smriti or remembrance is not considered knowledge, or for that matter memory, which is the cause of remembrance, which is the cause of episode of remembrance, is also therefore by the same token not considered as a source of knowledge. Apart from that, as pointed out, in Nyaya philosophy, consciousness and knowledge are considered, or knowledge, consciousness, awareness for that matter, are considered as synonyms, as adventitious qualities of the self. We'll talk more about it when we look at the notion of the self as propounded by the Naiyics. Whereas in other systems of Indian philosophy, it's not considered like this. Say, for example, what has been called by some scholars as Adhyatmic philosophies, or the spiritual traditions within Indian system. So the Nyaya also differs from spiritual or Adhyatmic philosophies in regarding consciousness as a quality, as a guna, produced in the self, or the Atman, only when the self is embodied and there is appropriate contact of the sense organs with the object. So Nyaya school thinks of consciousness as an additional property, as an adventitious property, as an accidental quality of the self. So self may be with or without knowledge. So self there is nothing in the self which which makes it conscious all the time. So that way, Nyayiks have a very peculiar notion of the self, which is very different from some of the other traditions, like say, for example, some of the idealist tradition, mainly including among them would be Shankara. Where self would be of the nature of consciousness, not consciousness being a quality of the self, but the self, the very idea of self, is considered almost synonymous with consciousness, or or pure awareness. Which is sort of in one of the texts, which is tantamount to Sakshi, the pure awareness aspect. Well, as opposed to that, Nyayiks seem to be a little closer to materialists rather than the idealists. So, according to them, self, is a kind of a self, is an independent entity, which could be with or without any accompanying qualities. So there is no essential quality that sort of always stays with the self. So, awareness or jnana or knowledge is only an adventitious quality, and self could be with or without it, depending on certain conditions, like the contact of the mind or manas with the self. As a matter of fact, awareness results from this contact between mind, which is internal organ, and the self. And mind is merely considered as a messenger, which on the one hand collects the data from the different sense organs and delivers it to the self, and it's atomic in nature, so it can be in touch with only one of the senses, not with all of them. But we sort of the speed with which we form our judgments is very quick, because the manas is thought of as being atomic in nature, as very subtle, sukshma. And because of its subtleness, it has an immensely fast speed. So, sort of in no time, it can collect data individually, discretely from different sense organs, but can only be in touch with only one of them. So, now further than that, knowledge could be of four kinds, depending upon its source. Knowledge is valid or prama when it is generated by an appropriate praman. So, could be of four kinds in the sense that there are four pramanas that Nayayiks admit of, which includes perception, pratyaksh, inference, Anumana, and then Upamana, and finally Shabda or word. So, a knowledge is valid or prama when it is generated by an appropriate pramana and agrees with its object. So, cognition is valid only when it is generated by one of these four pramanas and also truly reflects the nature of the object that it enlightens. So, its structure should be in complete agreement, should be congruent with the actual, structure of the object. A pramana thus is both the proper cause of a valid cognition, but also its justification. So, being the cause, it lends sort of its authority to the resultant piece of knowledge as well. But also at the same time, sort of it's not only the source of valid cognition, but also is the source of justification of that resultant knowledge. This unique combination of a causal theory and a justification theory of knowledge is almost unique in the history of philosophy. And this is according to Bina Gupta in Introduction to Indian Philosophy. Source of knowledge, that is pramana, though does not have any bearing upon the qualitative aspect of the resultant knowledge. This view is known as Pramana Samplava, and the view opposite of it is known as Praman Vyavastha. So, though knowledge could result from different sources, and those sources sort of lend their authority to their to the resultant knowledge, and also thereby produce a proof for that knowledge. But at the same time, the knowledge that results from different pramanas is not qualitatively different, meaning to say it will be the same object presented to us along with its actual structure. We would know the same object along with its sort of schematic unity, irrespective of what pramana we choose for the knowledge of it. So even if we know about an object through inference, whether we directly see it, the nature of the object that is presented to us in our cognition, and for that matter, the knowledge of it, the qualitative aspect of the knowledge remains constant. This view is known as Praman Samplava, which is opposed to another view which is called as Praman Vyavastha, according to which depending upon the source of knowledge, depending upon the pramana, the nature of resultant knowledge is different. So, and this view is followed by the Buddhists, who say that pratyaksha always results in a knowledge of a particular aspect of the world. So we know the object in its aspect of pure differentia when we use pratyaksha as the source of knowledge, and when we infer an object, then when the resultant knowledge is characterized by the aspects of generality. So perception is knowledge of an object as in its uniqueness, in its pure differential form. And the resultant knowledge from inference is the knowledge of it in along with its generality. So pratyaksha, as pramana and as an instance of knowledge is characterized by the knowledge of an object along with this unique particular nature called swalakshana, whereas anumana as the source of knowledge and as a particular kind of cognition is characterized by generality. So these are qualitatively two different kinds of knowledge episodes resulting in the knowledge of Swalakshana and Samanya Lakshana. Also, apart from that, invalid cognition could be only of two kinds, namely doubt, and which is the name for which is the word for which is sanshaya, and error. So cognition which is invalid could be of two kinds. One of them is doubt. Doubt is considered as aprama because it lacks certainty. So because it doesn't come to us in the form of a well ascertained judgment. Because for the purpose of acting towards an object, the minimum requirement would be a well ascertained judgment. So we cannot say, well, this object, which could be a table or a chair, if we say this is an object which could be a table and a chair, then I'm not very sure about how to act towards it. So ascertainment is one of the important features of a well-formulated judgment. And since doubt lacks it, Therefore, doubt is not included among the cases of valid cognition or prama. So, therefore, doubt is considered as a form of aprama or invalid cognition. Another kind of invalid cognition on Nyaya's account is vipraya or error. Now, error does not lack, the kind of certainty that is missing from judgments representing doubt, but error is a situation where something is cognized positively as that which it is not. So, it is a case of, so to speak, miscognition. So it's not that it's a cognitive episode which comes to us along with the certainty. It's a cognitive episode which has the quality of sort of ascertainment, so to speak, which has already passed through the process of ascertainment. But what it lacks is the element of truth. So vipraya is a situation where we happen to cognize a thing, so it's a well-formulated judgment, but we cognize a thing as what it is not. So it's a well-structured cognition which lacks the element of truth in it, which actually lacks the element of its actual correspondence with the object that is that it sort of represents. So these are the two kinds of invalid cognition. But then another question now that stands that crops up before us is, since cognitions could be both right and wrong, and since in the situation of vipraya also the same kind of certainty is noticed, then there must be a way of deciding the right cognition from the wrong one. So there must be a way of differentiating between the right cognition from the wrong one. What could that criteria be? In answer to that, the suggestion that Naiyayiks make is that the principle of veracity could be artha kriya karitva. Since our main motivation in making an effort is the successful activity, therefore successful activity could be considered as the mark of truth of an instance of knowledge. So basically here the idea is, if we have cognized something as it actually is, as actually is the case, then it would result in successful activity. And conversely, if our cognition results in a successful activity, it's a mark of its truth, through which we could differentiate it from our wrong cognition. So, arth kriya karitva could be, a principle of verification through which we could decide right cognition from the wrong one. Further, Naiyayiks also argue that whereas the truth and falsity of knowledge depends on the correspondence and non-correspondence to facts respectively, the test of its truth and falsity consists in inference from success and failure of our daily activities in relation to the object sought. True knowledge leads to successful activity. Sorry. False knowledge leads to failure and disappointment. So, therefore, as far as the veracity of a particular cognition is concerned, we arrive at that indirectly through through the process of inference. We infer it from the successful activity which is obtained, which would only be obtained, which would only result from our right cognition. This also brings us to another distinction that is made about the verification process of cognition. So this process of verifying the truth of a cognition indirectly by an external process. So which basically the intrinsic assumption here is the inherent assumption here is that the truth of a particular cognition, the truth of an instance of knowledge is not something intrinsic to it, but is derived extrinsically through the process of arth kriya karitva, through the process of it's resulting in successful activity. So this process of verification, which is based on assumption that truth is not inherent, is not something intrinsic to the knowledge, is called as Pramana. And as opposed to that, there is another view according to which all knowledge comes along with its own truth. So the truth is an intrinsic part of the knowledge situation. This view is adhered to by Prabhakaras and Advaitins. So, and the main objection that Svata Pramanavadins, meaning Prabhakaras and Advaitins, is that in Pratha Pramanavad, the question of veracity is actually shifted, is postponed a step further, not actually answered, because the question of veracity could in turn be also placed against the very process of verification that's being adhered to, because that's also kind of assumption that is being made. So if the criteria, if we come up with a criteria of deciding the truth of the matter, that criteria itself requires further reasoning for why we thought of that criteria and not something else, and this process would be endless. So it would lead to what is called infinite regress or anavastha dosh in Indian philosophy. So right cognition could be differentiated from wrong through the process of arth kriya karitva, which also sort of has another belief implicit in it, namely that truth is not something that is intrinsic to the knowledge situation, but is something that is extrinsically decided, and as opposed to that is the case of Svata Pramanyavad adhered to by Prabhakaras and Advaitins. So friends, this is so today we discussed the broad contours of the basic tenets of Nyaya philosophy in the beginning, and then we shifted our attention to their epistemology, and as a matter of fact, since Pramana, Prameya, and some of these epistemological issues also form, are also sort of the main parts of the different categories or padartha that are postulated by the Nyaya philosophy. Therefore, we began our discussion from epistemology. We'll carry on our discussion on Nyaya philosophy and shift our attention to some of the other categories of thought or padartha in our lectures to come. That's it for now. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this session on Nyaya philosophy. Dear friends, there is a lot more for you. In our forthcoming sessions, definitely we will be talking more. Friends, if you have any queries or feedback, then do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. With this note, we are taking your leave with the promise that we will be meeting again very soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.